The first time Min Soo-jin saw him, she was 23 years old and fast asleep in her cramped Seoul studio apartment. Rain drummed against her single window as she curled beneath her worn blanket, exhausted from another 14-hour shift at the marketing firm where she worked as a junior analyst. But in her dream, she wasn't tired at all. She was standing in a field of cherry blossoms, their pale pink petals falling like snow around her shoulders. The air smelled of spring and possibility, and somewhere in the distance she could hear the gentle strumming of a guitar. That's when she saw him, tall and lean, with dark hair that caught the filtered sunlight and eyes that seemed to hold entire galaxies. He was sitting beneath a tree, his fingers dancing across guitar strings, creating a melody that made her heart flutter in ways she'd never experienced. When he looked up and smiled at her, Soo-jin felt something shift inside her chest, like a lock clicking open after years of being sealed shut. His smile was warm and genuine, reaching his eyes in a way that made her feel as though she were the only person in the world who mattered. He stood slowly, setting his guitar aside, and walked toward her with confident, unhurried steps. "I've been waiting for you," he said, his voice deep and melodious, carrying the faintest hint of laughter. "I was beginning to think you'd forgotten about me." Soo-jin wanted to tell him that she'd never seen him before, that she couldn't possibly have forgotten someone like him. But the words wouldn't come. Instead, she found herself reaching out to touch his face, her fingertips grazing his cheek as if to confirm he was real. His skin was warm beneath her touch, and when he leaned into her palm, she felt a surge of emotion so intense it took her breath away. "Who are you?" she whispered. His smile deepened, and he covered her hand with his own. "I'm exactly who you think I am." And then, as dreams often do, the scene began to fade. The cherry blossoms dissolved into morning light, and Soo-jin woke with tears on her cheeks and an ache in her chest that felt like grief for something she'd never actually lost. She sat up in bed, her heart still racing from the vividness of the dream. Every detail remained crystal clear: the way his eyes crinkled when he smiled, the calluses on his fingertips from playing guitar, the sound of his voice saying her name like it was something precious. It had felt more real than her actual life, more meaningful than anything she'd experienced in her waking hours. That morning, as Soo-jin went through her usual routine of instant coffee and rushed preparation for work, she couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental had changed. She caught herself looking for him in crowds, scanning faces on the subway, expecting to see those familiar eyes looking back at her. It was ridiculous, she told herself. He was just a dream, a creation of her subconscious mind, tired from too much work and too little sleep. But when she closed her eyes that night, he was waiting for her again. This time, they were in a cozy cafe tucked away in one of Seoul's winding alleys. Rain painted streaks down the windows, while warm light spilled across wooden tables scattered with books and half-empty coffee cups. He was sitting across from her, his chin resting in his palm as he listened to her talk about her day. The intensity of his attention made her feel important, cherished in a way she'd never experienced in real life. "You look tired," he said, reaching across the table to brush a strand of hair from her face. "You work too hard." Soo-jin leaned into his touch, savoring the warmth of his fingers against her skin. "Someone has to pay the bills," she replied, though in the dream, the practical concerns of her waking life seemed distant and unimportant. "What if there was another way?" he asked, his thumb tracing gentle circles on her cheek. "What if you didn't have to carry everything alone?" The question hung in the air between them, loaded with possibilities that made her heart race. Before she could answer, his hand slipped to the back of her neck, drawing her closer across the small table. She could see the flecks of gold in his dark eyes, could smell the subtle scent of his cologne mixed with coffee and something uniquely him. "I wish you were real," she whispered, the words escaping before she could stop them. His expression grew serious, almost sad. "What makes you think I'm not?" And then she woke up, alone in her bed, with the taste of coffee still on her lips and the phantom sensation of his touch lingering on her skin. Days blended into weeks, and still the dreams continued. Each night brought a new encounter, a different setting, but always the same man with the same gentle hands and knowing smile. They walked through Namsan Park as autumn leaves painted the world in shades of gold and crimson. They shared street food in Myeongdong, laughing as sauce dripped down her chin and he reached over to wipe it away with his thumb. They sat on her apartment's tiny balcony, though in the dream it was spacious and filled with plants, talking until dawn about books and music and dreams they'd never shared with anyone else. The more time she spent with him in sleep, the more her waking life began to feel like the dream. Colors seemed muted in daylight, conversations felt hollow, and the constant buzz of Seoul's energy couldn't fill the growing emptiness inside her chest. Her coworkers began to notice her distraction. Her boss started making pointed comments about her declining performance, but Soojin found it impossible to care about spreadsheets and marketing campaigns when her heart was living in another world entirely. Her best friend, Young Mi-young, cornered her one evening at their usual after-work spot, a small soju bar tucked between a convenience store and a phone repair shop. "You've been acting strange for weeks," Mi-young said, pouring soju into their glasses with practiced efficiency. "It's like you're here but not really here, you know? What's going on?" Soojin stared into her drink, watching the clear liquid catch the bar's neon lights. How could she explain that she was falling in love with someone who only existed in her dreams? How could she describe the way her entire body came alive when she slept, only to feel half dead when she woke? "I've been having these dreams," she said finally, her voice barely audible over the bar's ambient noise. Mi-young leaned forward, her expression shifting from casual concern to genuine worry. "What kind of dreams?" "There's this man," Soojin continued, the words tumbling out faster now that she'd started. "He's perfect, kind and funny and beautiful, and when I'm with him, everything makes sense. But he's not real, Mi-young. He's just something my brain created, and I'm losing my mind because I'd rather be asleep than awake." Her friend was quiet for a long moment, processing this confession. When she finally spoke, her voice was gentle but firm. "Soojin, that's not healthy. Dreams are dreams. They're not meant to replace real life. But what if real life isn't worth living without him?" The question escaped before Soojin could censor herself, and she immediately regretted the worry that flashed across Mi-young's face. "Listen to me," Mi-young said, reaching across the table to grasp her hands. "You're one of the strongest, most capable people I know. Don't let some fantasy man make you forget who you are. Maybe you need to talk to someone, a professional." "I'm not crazy," Soojin interrupted, though even as she said it, she wondered if it was true. "I didn't say you were crazy, but you're clearly struggling, and there's no shame in getting help." That night, Soojin lay in bed staring at the ceiling, afraid to close her eyes. What if Mi-young was right? What if these dreams were some kind of psychological break, her mind's way of escaping a life that had become too difficult to bear? She thought about her routine, work, home, sleep, repeat, and realized that somewhere along the way, she'd stopped living and started simply existing. But when exhaustion finally claimed her, he was there waiting, as he always was. This time, they were in his apartment. At least, she assumed it was his. It was warm and lived in, with books stacked on every surface and a guitar leaning against the wall. Soft music played from somewhere she couldn't identify, and the scent of jasmine tea filled the air. He was cooking for her, moving around the small kitchen with easy confidence as he prepared what looked like her favorite meal. "You seem sad tonight," he observed, without turning around, as if he could sense her emotional state even with his back to her. "My friend thinks I'm losing my mind," Soojin admitted, settling onto the couch and pulling her knees to her chest. He turned then, his expression serious as he studied her face. "What do you think?" "I think," she paused, considering her words carefully. "I think I don't care if I am. Being here with you feels more real than anything else in my life." He crossed the room and sat beside her, pulling her into his arms with such natural ease that it felt like they'd done this 1,000 times before. His embrace was warm and solid, and she could feel the steady rhythm of his heartbeat against her cheek. "What if I told you that I dream about you too?" he said softly, his fingers combing through her hair. Soojin pulled back to look at him, confusion written across her features. What do you mean? What if I told you that somewhere else, in another bed, in another part of the city, there's a man who falls asleep every night hoping to see you? What if these aren't just dreams, but something more? The possibility hung between them like a bridge she was afraid to cross. That's impossible. Is it? He cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs brushing away tears she didn't realize she'd shed. In a world where two people can fall in love through a screen, where hearts can break over words typed on a phone, is it really so impossible that souls might find each other in dreams? Before she could answer, he leaned down and kissed her, soft and sweet and desperate all at once. She melted into him, pouring all her longing and confusion and hope into that single point of contact. When they broke apart, both breathing hard, she saw her own emotions reflected in his eyes. "I love you," she whispered, the words falling into the space between them like stones into still water. "I love you too," he replied, and she believed him with every cell in her body. But morning came, as it always did, and with it the harsh return to reality. The next few days were torture. Soo-jin found herself unable to concentrate on anything, her thoughts constantly drifting to their conversation. What if he was right? What if somewhere in Seoul, there was a real person having the same dreams? The rational part of her mind rejected the idea as fantasy, but her heart clung to the possibility like a lifeline. She began paying closer attention to the men around her, on the subway, in coffee shops, walking past her office building. Was he tall with an athletic build? Did he have the same gentle hands she'd memorized in her dreams? She found herself studying faces, looking for familiar features, listening for a voice that might match the one that whispered her name in the darkness. The search felt both hopeless and necessary. Seoul was home to nearly 10 million people. What were the chances of finding one specific person based on dreams that might not even be real? But the alternative was accepting that the love she felt, the connection that had become the center of her existence, was nothing more than her brain's elaborate fiction. 3 weeks after her conversation with Mi-young, Soo-jin made a decision that surprised even her. She had always been practical, cautious, the type of person who researched restaurants extensively before trying them and kept detailed budgets tracked to the one. But love, she realized, required a different kind of courage. She started going to places from her dreams. The cafe where they'd shared countless conversations turned out to be real, a tiny spot in Insadong that served excellent coffee and had the same wooden tables she remembered. She became a regular, arriving early each morning before work and staying late some evenings, always watching, always hoping. The owner, an elderly woman with kind eyes, began to recognize her and would smile when she entered. "Waiting for someone?" the woman asked one evening as Soo-jin sat alone at her usual table, a half-empty cup growing cold in front of her. "Something like that?" "Sue," Jin replied, not sure how to explain that she was waiting for someone who might not exist. "Love makes us do strange things," the woman said with a knowing smile. "But sometimes the strange things are the ones worth doing." The cherry blossom grove from her first dream was harder to locate, but Soo-jin eventually found it in a small park in Gangnam. The trees were bare now, winter having claimed their delicate petals, but she could still picture how they'd looked in her dream, pink and perfect and infinite. She stood beneath the tree where he'd been sitting with his guitar, running her fingers over the rough bark and wondering if her mind had invented the entire scene or if it was a memory of something that had actually happened in some parallel version of reality. Her apartment's tiny balcony became a shrine of sorts. She bought plants, lots of them, transforming the small space into something that resembled the garden from her dreams. She would sit there in the evenings, wrapped in blankets against the cold, staring out at the city lights and wondering if he was somewhere out there, looking back. The dreams continued, but they began to change. Instead of new adventures and romantic scenarios, they became conversations about searching and longing and the terrible hope that comes with loving someone you're not sure exists. He seemed sadder in these dreams, more distant, as if the barrier between their worlds was growing thicker. "I'm looking for you," she told him one night as they walked along the Han River, the city lights reflecting off the dark water like scattered stars. "I know," he replied, his hand warm in hers. I'm looking for you too. What if we never find each other? He stopped walking and pulled her into his arms, holding her tight against his chest. She could feel his heart beating, strong and steady and real. Then we'll have this, he said into her hair. We'll always have this. But this began to feel less like enough, and more like a beautiful form of torture. Soo-jin found herself sleeping more and more, calling in sick to work, ignoring me, Young's increasingly worried phone calls. She was disappearing into her dreams, and part of her didn't care if she ever came back. It was on a Tuesday in late February that everything changed. Soo-jin was sitting in the Insadong cafe, as had become her habit when she heard it, the sound of a guitar being tuned, the same melody she'd heard in her very first dream. Her heart stopped, then began racing so fast she felt dizzy. Slowly, afraid to hope and afraid not to, she turned toward the sound. In the corner of the cafe, partially hidden behind a pillar, a man sat with an acoustic guitar across his lap. His dark hair fell across his forehead as he bent over the instrument, his fingers moving across the strings with practiced familiarity. From her angle, she could only see his profile, but something about the curve of his jaw, the set of his shoulders, made her breath catch in her throat. As if sensing her gaze, he looked up. Time stopped. The guitar slipped from his hands, clattering to the floor with a discordant sound that made several other patrons look up from their conversations. But neither Soo-jin nor the man seemed to notice. They stared at each other across the small cafe, recognition dawning on both their faces like sunrise after the longest night. It was him. The eyes that had looked at her with such tenderness in 100 dreams, the hands that had touched her face with reverent care, the smile that had made her believe in love when she'd given up on everything else. He was real, and he was here, and he was looking at her like she was a miracle he'd stopped believing could happen. Slowly, as if moving through water, he stood from his chair. She rose from hers at the same time, their movements perfectly synchronized, as though they'd rehearsed this moment in another life. They moved toward each other, navigating between tables and other people who seemed to fade into the background, until there was nothing in the world except the space between them growing smaller with each step. They stopped just out of arm's reach, both breathing hard, both afraid that speaking might break whatever spell had brought them together. I know you, he said finally, his voice exactly as she remembered it, deep and warm and full of wonder. You're real, she whispered, tears streaming down her face without her permission. So are you, he reached out tentatively, his fingertips barely grazing her cheek, as if testing whether she might dissolve at his touch. When she didn't disappear, when his touch sent the same electric current through her that it always had, he cupped her face fully in his hands. Oh God, you're real. The cafe around them seemed to hold its breath. Even the elderly owner had stopped wiping down tables to watch this impossible reunion, a soft smile playing at the corners of her mouth, as if she'd known all along that this moment would come. What's your name? Soo-jin asked, though part of her felt like she already knew. Park Ji-hoon, he said, and hearing his name felt like coming home. And you're Min Soo-jin? She nodded, not even surprised that he knew. Of course he knew. He'd been loving her in dreams for months, just as she'd been loving him. I've been looking for you everywhere, she said, her hands coming up to cover his where they still cradled her face. I know. I've been looking too. Every cafe, every park, every place we've been together in. He paused, seeming to struggle with the impossibility of what he was about to say. In our dreams. You dream about me too. Every night for 3 months, he confirmed. Every night I fall asleep hoping to see you. And every morning, I wake up feeling like I've lost the most important part of myself. They stood there in the middle of the busy cafe, holding each other's faces, crying and laughing and trying to make sense of something that defied all logic. Other patrons were starting to stare more openly now, some taking pictures with their phones, but Soo-jin couldn't bring herself to care. After months of living in dreams, reality had finally caught up. How is this possible? She asked. Ji-hoon shook his head, his thumbs brushing away her tears with the same gentle touch she remembered from countless dreams. I don't know. I've been asking myself the same question every day. Maybe Maybe some connections are stronger than the boundaries between sleeping and waking. Maybe some love is powerful enough to exist in both worlds. The explanation was impossible, unscientific, the kind of thing that belonged in fairy tales rather than real life. But as Sujin looked into his eyes she'd memorized in dreams, eyes that held the same love and recognition and desperate relief she felt, she realized that she didn't need to understand it. Some things were too beautiful to be explained, too perfect to be questioned. "I love you," she said, the words carrying the weight of months of longing and hope and faith in something she couldn't name. "I love you too," he replied, and then he was kissing her, right there in the cafe where they'd shared so many dream conversations. His lips were soft and warm and tasted like coffee and promise, and kissing him felt like the most natural thing in the world, like something they'd done 1,000 times before. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, the entire cafe burst into spontaneous applause. The elderly owner was wiping tears from her eyes, and even the barista had emerged from behind the counter to witness this impossible love story playing out in her establishment. "I have so many questions," Sujin said, her forehead resting against his. "Me too," Jihoon admitted, "but maybe we have time for answers now. Maybe we have all the time in the world." They talked until the cafe closed, then walked through the streets of Seoul as the city settled into evening. Every step felt surreal, like they were still dreaming. But the cold air on their faces and the solid feel of the pavement beneath their feet confirmed that this was wonderfully, impossibly real. Ji-hoon, it turned out, was a music teacher at a small private academy in Gangnam. He lived alone in a studio apartment not unlike her own, and yes, he played guitar, had been playing since he was 12 years old. The song she'd heard him playing in her first dream was one he'd written himself, a melody that had come to him in sleep and refused to leave him alone until he'd figured out the chords. "I started having the dreams about 3 months ago," he explained as they walked along the Han River, the same path they'd taken in so many sleeping encounters. "At first, I thought it was just my subconscious processing loneliness, you know? But they were so vivid, so consistent. And you were always the same. Same face, same voice, same way of making me feel like I was the most important person in the world. The dreams felt more real than my actual life," Sujin admitted. "I started sleeping more and more, just to be with you. My friend thought I was having some kind of breakdown." "Maybe we were," Jihoon said, stopping to lean against the railing overlooking the water. "Maybe we broke down the barriers between possible and impossible, between dreaming and waking. Maybe love really is that powerful." As winter gave way to spring, they built a life together that felt both brand new and comfortably familiar. Their first official dates were to places they'd been together in dreams: the Cherry Blossom Grove in Gangnam, now in full bloom, various cafes around the city, the small balcony garden Sujin had created in imitation of her dream version. Everything was exactly as it had been in sleep, yet somehow more. The coffee tasted richer, the music sounded sweeter, and touching him, really touching him, feeling the solid warmth of his body, the steady rhythm of his breathing, was like experiencing color for the first time after a lifetime of black and white. Their friends were baffled by how quickly they seemed to fall into sync. Mi-young, initially suspicious of this man who had appeared seemingly out of nowhere, was won over by the obvious depth of their connection and the way Sujin had transformed from a tired, distracted shell of herself back into the vibrant woman she'd always been. "It's like you've known each other for years," Mi-young observed one evening as the three of them shared dinner at a Korean barbecue restaurant. "The way you anticipate what he's going to say, how he knows exactly how you like your food prepared. It's uncanny." Sujin and Jihoon exchanged a look across the table, the kind of wordless communication that spoke of deeper understanding. "We have known each other for years," Jihoon said simply, "just not in the way most people would understand." 3 months after their meeting in the cafe, Jihoon moved into Jin's apartment. It was a practical decision. His lease was ending, and they were spending every night together anyway, but it felt like the most natural progression in the world. His guitar found a home in the corner where she'd always pictured it. His books integrated seamlessly with hers, And suddenly the tiny space that had felt like a prison became a sanctuary. The dreams didn't stop entirely, but they changed. Instead of desperate longing and searching, they became glimpses of possible futures. A larger apartment, with room for his music equipment and her art supplies. Children with his eyes and her stubborn streak, growing old together while watching Seoul change around them. Sometimes they would wake at the same moment and compare their dreams, laughing to discover they'd shared the same visions of days yet to come. It was as if their sleeping minds were still connected, still planning and hoping and building castles in the air that somehow felt more like blueprints than fantasies. "Do you think we're crazy?" Soo-jin asked one morning as they lay tangled together in the early light, both still drowsy from shared dreams of a wedding in the cherry blossom grove. "Probably," Ji-hoon replied, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. "But if this is madness, I never want to be sane." A year later, they were married in the Gangnam Park, where Soo-jin had first gone looking for the cherry blossom grove from her dreams. The trees were in full bloom, petals falling around them like snow, as they exchanged vows they'd been practicing in sleep for months. The elderly cafe owner from Insadong was there, beaming in the front row and dabbing at her eyes with a handkerchief. In his wedding speech, Ji-hoon talked about the power of dreams to shape reality, about love that transcends the boundaries between sleeping and waking, about finding the person who makes your soul feel at home. There wasn't a dry eye in the small gathering of family and friends who had come to witness this impossible love story made manifest. "They say that life is what happens when you're busy making other plans," he said, looking directly at his new wife as cherry blossoms caught in her hair. "But sometimes, if you're very lucky, life is what happens when you stop making plans and start believing in dreams." Years passed. They moved to a larger apartment with space for his music studio and her pottery wheel, a hobby she'd picked up after dreaming about creating beautiful things with her hands. They traveled to places they'd visited in sleep, always finding them exactly as their dreams had promised. They weathered the normal challenges of married life, but with the unshakable foundation of having literally dreamed of each other before they met. When their first child was born, a daughter with Ji, Hoon's musical ear, and Soo, Jin's artistic eye, they would take turns singing her to sleep with the melody he'd been playing in that first dream, the song that had somehow bridged the gap between impossible and inevitable. "Tell me the story of how you met Daddy." Their daughter would beg when she was old enough to understand, though young enough to believe in magic. "Well," Soo-jin would begin, settling into the rocking chair by the window as Seoul sparkled beyond the glass. "Once upon a time, there was a girl who fell in love with a boy in her dreams, and she would tell the story of two souls who found each other across the impossible distance between sleeping and waking, who built a love so strong it refused to be confined to just one reality. She would tell it like the fairy tale it was, leaving out the doubt and fear and desperate searching, focusing instead on the magic of connection that transcends physical laws and logical explanation. Because some love stories, Soo-jin learned, are too beautiful to be anything but impossible. And sometimes, if you're brave enough to believe in the impossible, it becomes the most real thing in your life. In the end, it didn't matter whether their dreams had been some kind of psychic connection, a cosmic coincidence, or simply two lonely souls creating the same fantasy independently until reality bent to accommodate their shared longing. What mattered was that they had found each other, that they had been brave enough to believe in something that couldn't be explained, and that they had built a life that was even more beautiful than anything they could have dreamed. Every night, as they fell asleep in each other's arms, Soo-jin would think about that first dream, standing in the cherry blossom grove, watching a stranger with a guitar who somehow felt like home. She would remember the ache of waking up alone, the desperate search through Seoul's crowded streets, the moment when impossible became inevitable. And sometimes, just before sleep claimed her completely, she would wonder if somewhere else in the city, in another small apartment or another crowded cafe, another lonely soul was falling asleep and dreaming of their perfect love. She would wonder if their story was just one of many. If Seoul was full of people searching for someone they'd only met in dreams, the thought made her smile as she drifted off to sleep, safe in the arms of the man who had loved her before they met, who had waited for her in a world that existed only when her eyes were closed, who had proven that sometimes the most impossible things are the most real things of all. In her dreams that night, they were young again, standing in the cherry blossom grove where it all began. He was playing his guitar. She was falling in love. And somewhere between sleeping and waking, their story was beginning all over again, as fresh and full of possibility as the first time she'd heard his voice say, "I've been waiting for you." Some love stories, after all, are worth dreaming forever.